Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, El Mencho. These are notorious drug lords known for their ruthlessness and brutality, but they didn't climb to the top of the pyramid or stay there for so long. Kingpins as tough as these have always made sure to stay surrounded by super dangerous hitmen. They protected their bosses and destroyed their families. Sometimes they even took pleasure in doing so. Yes, some of these people are real-life monsters. Let's explore drug lords' most dangerous hitmen ever. Trigger warning. This video will contain very graphic descriptions of extreme violence and murder. Watch on at your own risk. Do you remember that horrible scene in Breaking Bad's pilot episode where Jesse tries to dissolve a body in his tub? What if I told you movies are just an imitation of life? Yes, this is El Pozolero. Real name, Santiago Meza Lopez. He was El Chapo's most trusted body dissolver. El Pozolero means the soup man, and it's a reference to the Mexican soup pozole, a traditional soup made with meat and corn. Am I painting a gruesome enough picture? Santiago had a modest background. He was a poor farmer's boy and liked animals. In fact, it was his love of animals that brought him to the cartels. Well, that and a desperate need for cash. Santiago started working with the Arellano Felix cartel in 1996, tending to their horses and doing their masonry work. It was honest work that simply paid better compared to anything he could do on his farm. But you know how cartels promise you endless riches for just a little bit of dirty work. That's always the hook. Make a threat, beat someone up for not paying up, or carry out a sketchy drug deal. Within months, you'll be rich. Sadly, Santiago fell into this trap, and before long, he was conducting narcotics deals for Arellano Felix. But he started to like the cash. He progressed from dealer to drug office keeper, as the Felix brothers liked his discipline. Just before 2000, the Arellano Felix cartel started a bloody turf war with the notorious Sinaloa cartel. Constant attacks, kidnappings, and assassinations were terrorizing Mexico. A staggering 24,000 people lost their lives during just a few years. But what to do with all the bodies if you're a cartel boss and you don't want the police on your tail? In a really creepy twist, the piles of victims opened up a job opportunity for Santiago. In the late 1990s, the Arellano Felix brothers, Ramon and Benjamin, invited Santiago to a secluded spot. They asked him to do a little experiment with them. They handed him a leg of beef and asked him to toss the leg into a container. The vat was filled with caustic soda, also known as lye, mixed with water and some other chemicals. They left Santiago with the container and told him to watch over the beef while they took care of other business. A few hours later, Santiago would confirm their experiment worked out the way they intended it to. The leg of beef was completely dissolved, only coloring the liquid inside the container a crimson red. Yes, it was gross, but it was nothing compared to what was about to happen. 6 months later, the Felix brothers revealed to Santiago what the experiment was about. He was going to carry out their dirtiest work, dissolving their enemies into vats of lye. The brothers had asked for advice from foreign cartel members about disposing of corpses. They were in over their heads, quite literally, in bodies, and simply dumping them in shady spots wasn't working anymore. The police were on the lookout for any cartel mistakes so they could arrest the Tijuana cartel bosses and end the war. Now, Ramon and Benjamin had Santiago dissolve his very first human body in front of their eyes. Santiago undressed the body and stuffed it into a large drum, filled the same mixture as before, except this time there were 200 liters of it. The drum's burner was lit up and the mixture started to froth. Santiago left it overnight to cook. When he returned to the vat in the morning, there was no body inside, just a red sludge and some tiny bone fragments decorating the bottom of the container. And so, El Pozolero was born. After El Pozolero notified the Arellano Felix brothers of their successful experiment, they called in their truck driver. He took the container and drove it to a nearby canyon in the dead of night. He tossed the remains in there and carried the container back to the cartel headquarters. This would be the Tijuana cartel's preferred method of dealing with the bodies, and Santiago became their chief cleaner. Pozolero was in charge of everything, buying oil containers, caustic soda, latex gloves, and gas masks. Yes, everything about this job was simply horrifying, and El Pozolero seemed to be completely desensitized to it. Drug lord Teodoro Garcia Cimental, aka El Teo, would send El Pozolero a text message with a location location every time he had a new body that he needed to get rid of. El Pozolero would arrive at the specific location, but it wouldn't be a simple exchange. A cohort of cars would pull up, and he would be called out to find out which car the body was in. Then 2 henchmen would help El Pozolero carry the body into his vehicle, and then he would drive off to his lab. There he would take care of the body. Sometimes it would be several bodies simultaneously. Soon, business was booming, and El Pozolero had his own graveyard. In 2008, El Teo decided to switch sides and join the biggest rival cartel around, El Chapo's Sinaloa. Since El Pozolero was his man, he took him with him. This is how El Pozolero became the Sinaloa's cartel's chief body disposer too. This is creepy on many levels. He was now dissolving the bodies of his former colleagues, but he didn't seem to care. El Pozolero made $600 a week. In his time and place, this was excellent money. He could afford almost anything he wanted, and he achieved a disturbing kind of stardom in the cartel world. But his gruesome work stint with the Sinaloa cartel would come to a swift end in less than a year. In January 2009, Mexican authorities tracked him down after an anonymous tip pointed them in his direction. When the officers barged in, he was stirring something smelling horrible. He was dead drunk and would slur his words. The officers asked him about the concoction. He claimed it was seafood soup. You can only imagine what it really was. After his arrest, however, El Pozolero decided to confess. He told detectives he had dissolved around 300 bodies, but it's believed the actual number is over 1,000. With Santiago in prison, the police went on to discover his gruesome burial site, called the Chicken Coop. 250 kilos, or 500 pounds, of bones and bone remains were extracted by 2017. In 2012, he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. During his trial, he said that he was not a dealer, a killer, or a monster. He was just a man doing his job for a cartel that wouldn't take no for an answer. Was his life really in danger if he quit his job, or was he just getting a kick out of it? This is a really gruesome one. Today, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, aka El Mencho, is Mexico's most wanted man. His cartel, the CJNG, has terrorized Mexico since 2009 and is largely responsible for the synthetic opioid crisis in the U.S.
The DEA says his cartel, called Cartel Jalisco, or CJNG, is responsible for roughly a third of the drugs entering this country by land and by sea.
The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or the CJNG, has made its name as Mexico's bloodiest and most feared cartel, and it's all thanks to El Mencho's military organized structure, and well, the military weapons he keeps buying for his men.
And in July, footage would emerge of that CGNG convoy. These gunmen call themselves the Elite Group and pledge allegiance to El Mencho. They're armed with assault rifles with grenade launchers attached to the barrel, heavy machine guns, and also this gun. This is a .50 caliber sniper rifle. It's a powerful weapon that the CJNG loves to show off.
The CJNG rules by fear, kidnapping, torturing, and killing anyone who stands in their way. Sometimes it rivals cartels. Other times, it's police officers, their families, and even unlucky civilians.
Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, is the single criminal organization most responsible for these deaths on both sides of the border.
The Jalisco New Generation Cartel took the fight to the next level, shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade.
Tonight, the DEA is offering $10 million for information leading to the arrest of the Mexican drug kingpin known as El Mencho.
They have no regard for human life. All they care about is making more money and spreading the message that no one should mess with them. But El Mencho doesn't just do this with military weapons and an organized structure. He also recruits the absolute worst people in Mexico. One of them is Fabian Urbino Morales, aka El Payaso. El Payaso means the clown in Spanish. Creepily enough, Fabian Morales really did work as a circus clown when he was younger. Then he traded his clown suit for guns, machetes, and knives, but he kept the mask. Fabian Morales used to work for Los Metros Cartel, which was a smaller faction of the Gulf Cartel. He quickly climbed Los Metros ranks and brought a new level of psychopathic violence to the gang. He had his own henchmen, all wearing the same horrible clown mask. El Mencho saw Morales and his gang burning and flaying his victims alive. For him, this was proof that Morales would make a great captain. As I said, El Mencho recruits the very worst people around. In the 2010s, El Mencho had his very own and very disturbing clown army. Eventually, the CJNG recruited the whole Los Metros cartel and engulfed them into their gang. Fabian Morales became El Mencho's trusted man, So trusted that El Mencho encouraged him and his henchmen to keep wearing the terrifying masks. It went hand in hand with their plan to spread fear and panic. Morales became one of the commanders of the criminal structure of Miguel Fernandez's LM2, lieutenant of one of the CJ&G's regions. With his most evil side encouraged by El Mencho, it wasn't long before Morales became one of Mexico's worst real-life monsters. Sadly, this was happening in an age where it was very easy to film and post things online, so El Mencho's clowns began showing their unspeakable acts of torture to the world. It's unclear whether the infamous Quiero Agua video was done by Fabian Morales under his orders or just by his vile henchmen. In the video, the CJ&G clowns have kidnapped a rival cartel member, most likely a former member of La Familia, but the victim has never been identified, as the video begins with a flayed face. Indeed, the 30-second video shows a man inches away from death after the evil clowns had already removed all the skin from his face and other parts of his body. As if this is not heartbreaking enough, Morales and his gangs taunt their victims, mocking him and laughing at his pain. At one point, the men keep asking him if he wants water, but imagine having to talk without a face.
Agua? Dime recio.
The man wheezes with pain. It's pretty clear he just wants to die, but the clowns keep taunting him, keeping him alive for as long as possible. His voice is raspy and weak, but this only amuses the clowns. Seeing a scene like this in a horror movie could be enough to give you sleepless nights, and maybe even anxiety attacks, so it's hard to comprehend how a bunch of people could do this to another human being, then somehow laugh at it. To think Morales and his clowns were once children, can you imagine the violence they witnessed and perhaps even suffered before they became these psychopathic monsters? In January 2020, the Michoacan police launched a huge sting operation on the CJ&G. At last, they got their hands on El Payaso and a few of his henchmen. Before we move on, I have a little ask for you. Please don't go looking for these kinds of videos. They will only damage your mental health. Nothing good comes from watching real-life brutality and murder. Nothing. Nelson Hernandez, aka Blackie, had been Pablo Escobar's right-hand man since the early 1970s, the very beginning of the notorious Medellin cartel.
They started to bring in cocaine from Peru, from Bolivia, and converting it into cocaine hydrochloride. And then from there, they had access to the Caribbean Ocean.
By 1980, Pablo Escobar became a billionaire, monopolizing the production and smuggling of white powder by bribing authorities and killing the incorruptible.
Forbes magazine came out with the richest men in the world, and he was right near the top of the list. So right off the bat, you knew that this man was not a millionaire, he was a billionaire.
Now he had his famous estates, helicopters, and exotic animals.
The ranch had 9 man-made lakes, water slides, life-size dinosaurs made out of fiberglass. We estimate that he easily spent, maybe about $10 million in constructing that ranch.
But he wasn't safe anymore. When you're at the top of the illegal game, several people will want you dead and plot your demise every single day. So Pablo Escobar needed men he really trusted to keep him and his family safe. Enter Nelson Hernandez. Blackie, who earned his questionable nickname due to his African descent, was such a trusted servant. Escobar often left him to watch over his family. But just because he took care of Pablo's family doesn't mean Nelson was a softie. He was responsible for kidnapping Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, killing judges, carrying out the 1993 Bogota bombing, and setting fire to incriminating evidence. This was precisely what made him such a trusted servant. He was willing to do anything for his boss. In 1992, Blackie helped Escobar in the execution of the infamous Gerardo Moncada. Blackie and Escobar's other lieutenant, Velasco, beat him to death and dismembered him. Later in 1992, the vigilante group Los Pepes murdered his girlfriend and father-in-law at their house in Medellin after they denied knowledge of where Blackie was. Los Pepes became responsible for slowly disseminating the Medellin cartel and helping the government catch Escobar. The following year, Blackie organized the Bogota bombing. It was no joke. 20 were dead, 70 were seriously injured, and the horrendous video from the attack even shocked Blackie himself. Reportedly, he apologized to God as he watched the TV news. When the DEA arrested him, he gave them the information on Juan Diego Diaz and helped them bring down the Medellin cartel bit by bit. Due to Blackie's information, the search block could organize their famous Monte Cassino raid. This is why no one knows where Nelson is today. He is most likely under witness protection in the United States. If he is still alive, if he'd ever come back to Colombia, his former cartel friends would not be too happy about his collaboration with the DEA. This story begins with another man called Hector Luis Palma, aka El Güero. When he was a teen, he was hired as a hitman for Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the name, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, or El Padrino, was the father of all cartels, if you will. He founded the Guadalajara cartel in Jalisco, Mexico in 1978. El Padrino was the first to have a lucrative relationship with Colombian manufacturers, ensuring a smooth smuggling of white powder and weed into the U.S. In 1980s, Guadalajara cartel had a monopoly over routes, U.S. borders, and pretty much everything pertaining to the narcotics trade. By the early 1980s, El Güero was one of El Padrino's chief smugglers, along with El Chapo. Yes, El Chapo started working in the Guadalajara cartel. So were Benjamin and Ramon Arellano Felix. They were El Padrino's nephews. One day, El Güero and his work partner, Abelardo El Lobito Radamosa, couldn't resist the temptation to keep a cargo, or they lost one, whichever story you believe. But this shipment was worth millions of dollars. The cartel was very strict when it came to doing as your bosses told you. The Felix brothers found out. They executed El Lobito on the spot. El Güero survived the attack, but he could never convince his bosses of his innocence. Benjamin and Ramon tried to persuade El Padrino to decrease El Guerrero's power within the cartel, but until El Padrino could decide what to do with his man, El Guerrero was arrested, and while he was in prison, El Padrino himself was arrested in a huge DEA operation. In 1989, the Guadalajara cartel would crumble fast, left without a boss. The result? 3 smaller cartels, Sinaloa, Tijuana, and Juarez. You already know this. Sinaloa cartel was led by El Chapo, and the Tijuana cartel was led by Arellano Felix brothers. When he got out of prison, El Guerrero joined El Chapo, but now there was an all-out war between El Chapo and the Arellano Felix brothers, and El Padrino still wanted El Guerrero to pay for that shipment he stole. Enter Rafael Enrique Clave Marino. This is a revenge story unlike any other. Marino was a Venezuelan man, described as very handsome and charming. Initially, Marino was supposed to seduce El Güero's sister, but the mission got much darker along the way. Through El Güero's sister, Marino befriended El Güero's wife, Guadalupe Lea. Guadalupe had 2 young children to take care of, and it had been a long time since she'd felt admired and desired. El Güero spent most of his time overseeing sketchy deals and bribing officials. He had no time for romantic love or for spending any time with his family, really. So when Marino came along, Guadalupe was very susceptible to charm. Within 2 weeks, she was head over heels and ready to start a new life with him. They ran off to San Francisco, and Marino convinced her to take out $7 million from the family's San Diego account. Around this time, El Güero finally caught on to what had happened, but he didn't know Marino had been planted by the Felix family. He thought it was his wife's decision, so he had a jealous rage and destroyed every valuable in their home. However, he didn't understand the true horror of the situation or what was about to happen. Soon after poor Guadalupe arrived at the San Francisco hotel, Marino cut her throat. Then he beheaded her and preserved her head in a cooler. He would send it to El Güero as a gift from a stranger. 2 weeks later, Marino took El Güero's 2 children, 5-year-old Hector Jesus and 4-year-old Natalie, to San Cristobal, Venezuela. On top of the Concordia Bridge, he threw the 2 children off the bridge and filmed everything so that their father could watch. Imagine the horror these poor children went through during those 2 weeks. First, they saw their mother die. Then they were kidnapped by the killer and dragged to his home country, where they were killed on tape. Then there's El Güero. Imagine receiving your wife's head and a tape of your children's murders as a gift from the cartel. As I said, drug kingpins recruit the absolute worst. Only a monster can manipulate someone into starting a new life with them and their kids afterwards. El Güero's life went downhill from there. He had Marino's 3 kids assassinated. Then he had Marino arrested and paid someone to kill him while in prison. But it didn't end there. Violence only leads to violence. El Güero was eventually arrested and extradited to the ADX Supermax, the U.S.'s highest security federal prison. And Rafael Marino? Well, he took his evil plan to fruition, and it wasn't even his personal vendetta. He only did it for money, for the Felix family. His untimely prison death is not that surprising at all. Dandani Munoz Mosquera was born in Colombia in 1966 and earned himself a cringy nickname, La Kika, which means fat girl in Spanish. La Kika joined Pablo Escobar's notorious Medellin cartel soon after being dishonorably discharged from the army for theft. If you think that's bad, wait till you hear what comes next. La Kika was simply the worst. He specialized in skinning enemies alive and castrating them for information, or punishment for not talking. And it gets even worse. Laquita also trained kids to become loyal, submissive soldiers in the cartel wars. Here's a very sad twist. Many of the worst cartel sicarios were once vulnerable teens coming from very poor or drug-addicted families. Cartels prey on people like this. They feel trapped in a horrible life and will do anything for quick cash. But once they join the cartel, they're forced to beat, torture, and kill someone. A sort of creepy initiation ritual. But it's not a ritual, not in the religious sense. This is just a way for the cartels to quickly desensitize these teens. Once you've taken a life in such a gruesome way, it's easier to take more. And this is what the cartels need. Real-life monsters who get a kick out of killing people. Laquita may have been one of the most vulnerable kids once, but as an adult, he was a proud recruiter of such teens. And after he was done with his enemies, he would carve the letters KK on their skin. That way he could take credit for his work. Yes, he was really proud of his work. And shockingly enough, he was the son of a policeman and an evangelist. The Mexican and American authorities wanted him behind bars for a long time before they actually managed to arrest him. After the 1989 plane bombing, the DEA finally had the authority to intervene on Colombian soil. 2 American citizens had died because of the meddling cartel. Laquita was partially responsible for the bombing. In 1994, the DEA got to Laquita. He was arrested, charged with just about everything, and sentenced to 10 life sentences. He's currently at the Florence Supermax, along with the Unabomber and El Chapo himself. He will never be free again. And the conditions inside the prison are cruel. Many human rights activists have spoken against ADX Florence. Here's what the warden said about the prison.
The experience there is like life after death. Or should I say, life there is worse than death.
It is said that around a third of the Florence Supermax inmates suffer from severe mental illnesses. But after spending day after day in solitary confinement, the other 2/3 might discover some new mental health issues too. A 2012 lawsuit against the ADX stated,
ADX prisoners routinely go days with only a few words spoken to them. The effects of long-term solitary confinement range from depression and anxiety to full-on hallucinations and psychotic breaks.
The only contact with the outside world from these cells is a 4-inch window, and looking out, you can only see the sky. That way, no inmate ever knows where their cell is or where their location around the prison. There are several accounts of ADX Florence inmates screaming for hours or hurting themselves as they simply go mad inside their tiny cells. The Florence Supermax inmates spend 23 hours a day confined to their tiny cells. And just those on their best behavior get a small black and white TV set.
The inmate's behavior is what drives their placement in here. By being violent, by being predatory, by being assaultive, by being escape prone, they are the ones that work their way into this facility.
Their spare hour is spent also alone, surrounded by prison guards, and they eat alone, except for their last year in jail. Except for Laquita, that's never been the case. He will spend the rest of his life alone, isolated, and extremely guarded. A light punishment, considering what he used to do for Pablo Escobar. Even lighter when you think he took pleasure in it. Thanks so much for watching. What are your thoughts on today's video? Do you know of other super dangerous hitmen? Let me know in the comments section. And before you leave, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you never miss a new episode. On to next time.